It seemed to me just to be something that had not been explored in scholarship up until that point. So a number of scholars, particularly, it seemed to be something that became quite pronounced in the latter half of the 20th century. We're looking more at the ways in which Jesus was embedded in this social, economic, cultural context of first century Palestine, and you start getting a lot of people talking about, I guess, Jesus is an itinerant and all that kind of stuff. But what interested me, or the contradiction that I saw, was the way in which that became romanticized. So the way in which supposedly Jesus' homelessness is a good thing, is championed as something that's an integral part of his mission, but also something that he chooses to enact. And so I saw this as a kind of, there's an interesting contradiction here in the way that in the case of Jesus it's seen as a good thing, whereas in the case of contemporary politics, what have you, it's seen as something that is not so great or not so favourable. I mean, it's quite a simple approach. It was simply Jesus' homelessness needs to be understood as a product, or whatever we mean by homelessness. I mean, people use that word, we could be talking about his itinerancy, his movements from place to place, his poverty, whatever. Any of those kind of dimensions need to be understood in terms of broader socio-economic and political forces, which are already there within the text. They're already discussed within scholarship, but Jesus is continuously and repeatedly sort of placed above it. And I can give a couple of good examples to answer the second question. So in terms of in the secondary literature, the ways in which Jesus' poverty, itinerancy, or whatever is discussed are ways that heighten his agency over a situation, are ways that kind of elevate him or romanticize it in a way. So a quote that I use from the first couple of pages of John Dominic Crossan's book on the historical Jesus, he says, Jesus is like a beggar. Be like a beggar, but do not beg. Like a beggar. To me, that's really interesting. It's this idea of his Jesus is kind of, as I've written about it, almost co-opting aspects of poverty culture in order to identify with the poor. But he's not poor himself. His mission is about kind of going and helping the poor and all that in a way that corresponds quite neatly to middle-class liberal Christians today, thinking that helping the poor is a good thing, or kind of charity culture is a good thing. And not to say that it's not. It's just that this is an interesting way of elevating Jesus above his own social condition. So broader socio-economic political forces affecting other peasants and peasant artisans don't seem to affect Jesus in quite the same way. Another good example is within, as I mentioned before, the work of Dennis Juling and Warren Carter, who are quite big figures within Matthean scholarship. They talk about this thing, voluntary marginality. And I find the whole emphasis on kind of Jesus' marginality as voluntary, as something chosen, is just a really peculiar way of talking about marginality, rather than something that is happening as a kind of, dynamic process between these broader forces, which are obviously happening and, affecting other people. And in the Gospel of Matthew, or scholarship on the Gospel of Matthew over the past couple of decades, there's been this big emphasis on marginality. So, like Warren Carter, who's progressing anti-imperial type readings of Jesus in the Gospels, he's got a commentary that comes out Matthew in the margins. Dennis Juling, social scientific kind of approach, and his book is called A Marginal Scribe on the Gospel Studies in the Gospel of Matthew. And then in historical Jesus scholarship, you've got this sort of marginality as well. But it seems that at the same time as discussing Jesus, or attributing this kind of marginal status to Jesus, it's something that he himself has chosen. In a way, he's marginal within his social context, but he's not a product of his social context. It's because he deliberately chose to be something different, or something better, or something... and in a sense, this is the kind of elevation of, I guess, a theological figure who is both part of his kind of social historical context, but also elevated above it. And almost the most hilarious thing about the very first book, in the first couple of pages, where he's talking about marginality and kind of explaining why he uses that title, he says, for whatever reason, Jesus became marginal. So rather than exploring it, he says, we're just going to take it as for granted that Jesus is marginal, and then kind of explore everything else, rather than thinking about, well, why is Jesus marginal in the first place? Like, what kind of precipitated that? Aspect of my book is to bring in this, and drawing on your work a bit, James, is bringing in this contemporary context of neoliberalism in a way within sort of neoliberal rhetoric. Certain concepts get emphasized or heightened, and they're capitalist concepts to do with entrepreneurial conduct. So this idea that Jesus could have been an entrepreneur, going to Cephas to find work.
Didn't you say something about went on business trips? I think there was a quote from a book.
Yeah, so I mean, this is interesting. I've just been reading Bart Ehrman's recent book on memory in Jesus, and found a couple of interesting quotes in there where he sort of hypothesizes about the spread of early Christianity, the tradition, and he's kind of debunking the whole eyewitness testimony aspect. And he's saying, people would have shared stories of Jesus even if they weren't eyewitnesses to Jesus. That was just something that they would do. But yeah, the way in which it's imagined is this kind of middle-class, universal, entrepreneurial subject who goes away on business trips, maybe stays in the Hilton or something, and spreads the gospel to his business associate. It's this kind of just this default assumption that people are functioning as individuals and in a kind of capital-enhancing way in their own person. So, and Jesus would have been like this as well. So, Jesus was going around bringing people to his cause, choosing to be homeless and kind of, and this was his way of amassing some kind of movement of, in a way that doesn't kind of make sense, I think, in that first century agrarian economic system, or even today, because obviously today that whole idea of entrepreneurialism is a projection of certain capitalist myths that doesn't correspond to the reality, but equally it doesn't correspond to the first century where most people are living on a kind of subsistence wage, if that. You have 10 to 15% of the population who are basically expendable, surplus to the demands of the elite-dominated economic system, or needs for food or whatever, and so just sort of fall away. It just doesn't correlate to that. Yes and no. I have quite a qualified answer, I think on the one hand, if you're thinking about Jesus and work and that whole tradition, it's mediated through the kind of immense influence of Weber's Protestant work ethic understanding. So it seems to me hugely just an assumption that you'll never shake, that actually Jesus and Christianity is about hard work, and this is the thing. So I think that the text can be read in a way that Jesus is all about work. It's about working for the kingdom. It's about the early disciples leaving behind their fishing nets and coming and fishing for men, or whatever. It's still work, right? So it's just work for something else, or work for another end, or work for the right ends. I think, but on that, although I kind of like the idea of an anti-work Jesus, again, I'm really hesitant if we're just going to end up romanticizing something about Jesus as if it means something to contemporary politics. Who cares whether Jesus is pro-work or anti-work? It actually shouldn't matter whether we're pro-work or anti-work, right? That's the thing that I keep questioning when I come to this. So, and this is what I find really interesting about the contradiction about Jesus and homelessness is that it's like, is Jesus' homelessness a good thing or a bad thing? Well, it seems that this is where the contradiction emerges, because within contemporary society, whether you're right-wing or left-wing or whatever your politics are, pretty much everyone says, yeah, homelessness is a bad thing. But when it comes to Jesus, it suddenly has to be transformed in some way at some unconscious level into something that's good, that's something that can be championed. And then this is where all the interesting sort of intellectual gymnastics happen, because there's this unassumed, just belief that anything that's said about Jesus has to somehow be justified and made turned into this good thing or this noble thing or whatever. So it's this. I would come at this the kind of idea if Jesus was anti-work ethic, and I wanted to be anti-work, whatever, with the same kind of thing. It's like it doesn't, whatever. I mean, yes, and the point to sort of add on to that is that, I think that the text can be read in multiple ways, and that's the point, and that's what we've seen through the history of the life, the afterlife of these texts, is that they continue to be read in completely contradictory ways, authoritatively. I think the commonality and the point that's interesting about it is the way that they're used to authorize or legitimate particular attitudes towards contemporary society or culture or what have you. I just feel like I have to resist. I have to. A good example of this is the recent stuff that we've been looking at in terms of the subversive Jesus, right? And so the subversive Jesus is this trope within, and it's not just Jesus, it's Paul, it's everything. Everything is subversive these days, whether it's, like Jesus or Paul resisting empire, or using non-canonical gospels to construct historical Jesuses, or whatever. Like, everything you do is subversive, it's undermining of some previous thing, and what's being fetishized here is this very idea of subversiveness, or this very idea that the text or the scholarship that we're constructing is useful in some sense. I think fundamentally we need to be understanding it in terms of the social structure of the ancient world and kind of the class structure, right? And by class, or class conflict, and by that I don't mean projecting back a kind of clash of bourgeoisie versus the proletariat, or some kind of modern capitalist class struggle. I mean understanding the ancient agrarian economic context in terms of its class stratification between the elite landholders owning the means of production, which is land, or controlling the means of production, which is land, and the majority of the population who are working that, who class broadly as peasants. And so I go into this a bit in the book, but obviously, and I mean, this is the interesting thing, that this research has already been done. It's not particularly new, but it's something that often gets forgotten or sort of distorted. And one of the distortions that we find is the slippage with what we might call the expendable class. So the expendables are those who are surplus to the needs of productivity in the ancient world. So, and this is one of the fundamental differences between an agrarian economy and a capitalist economy, is that capitalism is about accumulating more capital, whereas agrarian economics is basically about just feeding everyone, producing a small surplus for the elite, but not about massively accumulating wealth, which means that quite a large percentage of the population, sometimes like 10 to 15%, just had absolutely no role in the economy. They were sort of structurally built in, structurally unemployed. And it's within this that I kind of situate Jesus. I say, well, production and consumption in that economic model. So I mean, that's where I'd begin. And it seems to me that, and this is where, I mean, coming back to the sort of points that I was making to start with, although a lot of the stuff is discussed, Jesus is always embedded within it in a way that he does something different, right? So it's like, well, this was the normal economic system, but Jesus said, actually, give all the peasants equal payment or something like that, and so he was subverting the system, or he fed 5,000 people magically, which undermined Greco-Roman economics or something like this. And it's not to say that that isn't true in some sense, but it's that the way in which people want to read Jesus within a socio-economic context is the ways in which he was different from it, which to me seems to be going about it the wrong way. I think my sort of conclusion from the Homeless Jesus book in terms of answering this was that no, actually, I think, so you get this championing of Jesus as subversive, and even if we, and I'm wanting to resist this idea that his homelessness is subversive in some sense. And so I make the claim, I think, in the conclusion or something, that the most subversive thing you can do is say that his homelessness is like unhelpful, and and his poverty and kind of his whole mission is, but which leaves you in a bit of a conundrum. Like, what do you do with that? And so my next project, and what I'm trying to think about now, is ways in which we might kind of, so some of my other work as well has shown up the kind of the flaws and idealizing different political Jesuses as well. So this idea of a subversive Jesus, or I've written about the Jesus in John's Gospel as a kind of aristocrat, and someone who might, he's projected in a way or constructed in a way that might not be helpful to understanding class politics or whatever. And so now I'm trying to explore this idea of kind of politicizing the crowds or groups of people, collective subjects within particularly the Gospels. And I'm thinking about in terms of, say, the Gospel of Matthew, where there's actually been a lot written on the crowds, but often it's often to see them as this sort of one-dimensional or sometimes two-dimensional character who's a foil to Jesus, who, Jesus is the main star of the narrative, and this is the way we read it. And I'm thinking about this in terms of, well, why do we read the Gospels in that way? Why do we assume that Jesus is the one driving narrative events? So the way I want to read the text, and I might be reading against the grain, I don't know, but to emphasize the role of collective groups like the crowds, what have you, how are they driving narrative events? And in fact, if you kind of look at the Gospels, they do drive narrative events. So when it comes to the crucifixion, the temple scenes, the Jerusalem narratives, they're the ones who are kind of causing disturbances, getting the elite to, ask them what they favour, and the problem for, I guess, Christian readers of the text is that the crowds eventually side against Jesus. And so, but in a way this is a problem because it means that we, or contemporary readers, want to resist identifying with the crowds in some way. We have to distance ourselves from them. But what happens if we actually champion the crowds? And we said, no, they were the ones who were the true political agents driving the events that were happening at the time. And it's not as if this isn't already implicit in scholarship. Jesus would not have been killed historically if he didn't have some kind of following, or he didn't have a sort of amassment of people, and this is something that comes through quite strongly. And yep.
Just a quick interjection. Are there good crowds and bad crowds?
Well, this is the way that the Gospels construct them, yeah. But we don't have to side with what the Gospels say about the crowds, right? The Gospels themselves have a particular perspective on the crowds, but if we're going to do a political reading of the crowds and we want to sort of see them as, I don't know, just normative political agents who could go good or bad or whatever, why not?